Touch her again and find out. The bar fell silent the moment Daniel's voice cut through the noise, calm but edged with steel. He said, and three men in tailored suits, each worth millions, actually stepped back. Before we dive in, leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. Rain glossed the cobblestones along the riverfront, turning the reflections of neon bar signs into streaks of blurred color. Daniel Cole stepped inside the small riverside tavern and felt the warmth hit his skin like a soft tide. He shook the damp from his jacket, ordered a burger and a black coffee, and took a corner seat where he could hear the low thrum of the jazz trio tucked near the brick wall. For once, time felt like it was his own. Ava was safe at a friend's house for a sleepover, and his shop, the one place he poured every ounce of effort into since leaving the Coast Guard, was finally locked up after a double shift. He thought he might sit here long enough to let the smell of oil and salt water fade from his clothes and maybe even from his mind. But before the first sip of coffee could cool on his tongue, a different current moved through the room. Across the bar, three men in tailored suits huddled near the back exit, their conversation low and sharp-edged. Daniel noticed them the way a diver notices a sudden shift in water temperature, instantly, instinctively. The waitress, barely out of her 20s, stood stiffly between them. Her name tag read Nina, the letters catching the dim light like a quiet plea for someone to notice. She tried to slide past one of the men, but he stepped with her, blocking the narrow door. Their laughter wasn't friendly. It came clipped and forced, like a blade scraping across metal. A hand brushed her elbow and lingered. Daniel felt the old rescue reflex tighten inside him. Years of night calls, storms that turned harbors into chaos, boats capsizing in black water, had trained him to sense trouble before it surfaced. He knew the difference between harmless noise and the sound of something about to break. The bar's music carried on, but the air itself seemed to still. A couple in a booth paused mid-conversation. The bartender glanced up, then down again, as if hoping someone else would move first. He set his coffee down, barely touching it, and rose without hurry. His chair scraped softly against the worn wood floor. The men didn't notice until he was halfway across the room. Nina's eyes met his for a fraction of a second, wide, uncertain, and asking without words. Daniel's breathing slowed, not quickened. He'd learned long ago that control wasn't loud. It was quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat. When he reached them, he didn't speak right away. He let silence carry its own weight. The tallest of the three turned first, his cologne sharp, his smile shallow. "Something you need, friend?" he asked. The word friend stretched thin with arrogance. Daniel's voice cut through the room like a calm tide over rocks. "Touch her again and find out." No tremor, no raise in pitch, just steady steel. Everything stopped. The music from the trio faltered for a breath. The bartender froze with a glass halfway polished. Even the air felt suspended. The man's hand dropped from Nina's shoulder, as if burned. His companions exchanged quick glances, a silent calculation of power they couldn't quite measure. They were used to boardrooms and backroom deals where money dictated outcomes. This was different. Nina exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Daniel's stance didn't waver, feet planted like he was still on a rescue deck in high seas. He wasn't posturing. There was no bravado, only a simple, immovable line drawn in a world where lines too often blurred. The tallest man forced a laugh that cracked at the edges. "No need for trouble," he said, and motioned to his friends. They eased back, their expensive shoes silent against the floorboards. The room began to breathe again, conversation returning in hesitant waves. The trio slipped through the side door into the rain, their retreat almost invisible except for the sudden absence of tension. Daniel didn't follow. He stayed until the door latched behind them and the sound of their engine faded into the wet night. Nina's voice trembled when she spoke. "Thank you," she whispered. then louder, steadier. Can I get you another coffee? On the house? He shook his head at first, but saw the flicker of something, maybe the need to reclaim normalcy, in her eyes and nodded. Black is fine. She smiled faintly and hurried to the counter, shoulders no longer rigid. Daniel returned to his table, but his pulse stayed alert, a quiet current under the surface. Through the rain-specked window, he noticed a black sedan idling a few doors down, headlights glowing faintly like watchful eyes. He recognized the shape of a situation that might not be finished. Years of late-night rescues had taught him that danger rarely ended when the first wave passed. The jazz trio found their rhythm again. Conversations rose and fell. But Daniel sat with his cooling coffee and the faint metallic taste of adrenaline, knowing that what began as a simple stop for a burger and a drink had already shifted the course of the night. Perhaps the course of more than just the night. Somewhere out there, three powerful men were deciding what came next. And inside this quiet riverside bar, every soul who had watched him stand now knew that something unspoken but undeniable had just changed. Daniel's boots sounded heavier than usual on the old bar floor, each step deliberate enough to draw a faint creak from the planks. He didn't rush. The room seemed to stretch around him, the low jazz dissolving into a single, taut silence. Nina stood against the wall near the side door, her shoulders tight, eyes darting like a bird looking for escape. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a slicked-back cut, leaned closer, his arm sliding across her path. His fingers grazed the fabric of her sleeve as though he owned the space and her breath with it. She shifted, but he moved with her, a shadow with expensive shoes. Daniel stopped a few feet away. He didn't have to think about what to do next. His body already knew. Years of storm rescues had burned the process into muscle memory. Slow the breath, widen the stance, let the world's noise fade until only the immediate danger remains. He felt the old clarity settle in, a coolness sharper than adrenaline. "Touch her again and find out," he said. The words came steady and level, neither raised nor rushed, the way you might state a fact about the tide. The effect was instant. The entire bar stopped moving. A glass clinked somewhere in the silence and didn't break the spell. The jazz trio froze mid-note. Every face turned toward the sound of his voice. The three men blinked, their expressions flickering between confusion and disbelief. They were used to boardrooms where billions moved with a signature, where people bent to money without a second thought. This was different. The man blocking Nina's path straightened, but didn't step aside. "Excuse me?" he said, the edge of a scoff buried in his tone. Daniel didn't repeat himself. He simply held his ground, gaze fixed, breathing calm. The quiet stretched until the room itself seemed to lean toward him. The man shifted his weight, glancing to his companions for backup. One of them, a stocky figure with a designer watch, muttered something too soft to catch. A third, younger and sharper dressed, raised a hand as if to pull his friend back. Nina's chest rose and fell, like someone surfacing from deep water. Her hands trembled, but she didn't step away. She didn't have to. The tallest man's forced smile cracked. "No need for trouble," he said finally, the bravado leaking out of his words. He lowered his hand, the predatory confidence gone, and stepped back a half pace. Daniel didn't move. The silence he held was its own warning, heavier than any threat. The trio exchanged quick, silent signals, calculation in their eyes, and then, almost as one, they peeled away toward the door. The rain outside swallowed them, leaving only the echo of their expensive shoes and the distant idle of a car engine. The room exhaled. Conversations resumed in uneven bursts, as if people were relearning how to speak. The bartender shot Daniel a look that was part gratitude, part astonishment. Nina finally drew a steady breath. Daniel let the tension drain slowly, but didn't sit right away. He knew from experience that storms rarely end with the first flash of lightning. Outside, a black sedan's headlights flared through the wet glass before sliding out of sight. He stored the detail the way he once memorized a shifting current, understanding that this night had only begun to reveal its shape. Inside, he remained a quiet anchor in the room he had just steadied, aware of every heartbeat and of a line now drawn that no one present would forget. Rain swallowed the sound of the door as it swung shut behind the three men, their curses carried off into the night. For a moment the entire bar stayed in a strange pause, like the air itself was trying to catch up. Then chairs scraped softly, conversations restarted in broken pieces, and the jazz trio stumbled back into a hesitant melody. It was as if the room had forgotten how to breathe and was only now remembering. Daniel stayed where he stood until the silence loosened its grip, letting his eyes settle on Nina. She clutched a notepad against her chest as if it were a shield, her breathing uneven but her spine straightening little by little. "Thank you," she said finally, the words barely more than a whisper, but threaded with something stronger beneath. "Please, let me bring you another coffee, on the house." Daniel opened his mouth to decline. Gratitude was enough, but the look in her eyes stopped him. There was a need in the offer not for politeness, but for recovery. Accepting wasn't for him, it was for her. He gave a small nod. "Black," he said simply. Nina's shoulders eased as she turned toward the counter. The bartender, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, met Daniel's gaze and gave a single, respectful nod, the kind men reserve for someone who's just done something they quietly admire. No words followed. They weren't needed. Daniel returned to his corner table and lowered himself onto the worn chair. The cushion gave a faint sigh under his weight. From the outside, he appeared as calm as when he first walked in. But inside, the remnants of adrenaline still pulsed in slow, measured waves. Years of rescues had taught him to let that current run its course without fighting it. He clasped his hands loosely on the table, feeling the faint tremor in his fingers fade as his breath deepened. Through the rain-streaked window, the night glimmered with reflections of street lamps and neon signs. He caught sight of headlights pooling against the curb and focused until the outline sharpened, a black luxury sedan idling across the street. The engine was running, exhaust curling like pale smoke into the damp air. His pulse quickened, not in fear but in recognition. Trouble rarely ended where it started. Nina returned with a steaming mug, placing it carefully in front of him. "You didn't have to step in," she said, her voice steadier now. "But I'm so glad you did." Daniel met her eyes and offered the quiet half-smile of a man who doesn't think heroism needs a name. "No one should have to ask for help to be left alone," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, as if committing the words to memory, then slipped away to greet a new customer at the far end of the bar. The coffee was hot and strong, but he barely tasted it. His attention drifted again to the dark shape across the street. Rain tapped the window in soft, uneven rhythms. He could imagine the three men inside the sedan, their faces lit by dashboard glow, voices low as they recalculated. Men like that didn't simply retreat. They regrouped. Daniel's mind shifted into the quiet precision that had saved lives on wild seas. He noted the license plate's shape, the timing of the engine's idle, the way the wipers cleared and paused. He wasn't planning an attack, he was mapping possibilities. Every rescue started with understanding the current before you moved. Around him, the tavern warmed back to life. Laughter returned in careful bursts. Someone clinked a glass in a hesitant toast. But Daniel knew the night's true story wasn't over. Beyond the wet glass, under the hum of the rain and the jazz, something waited, and he would be ready when it stepped back into view. Nina returned with the coffee balanced carefully on a small tray, her hand steadier now, but her eyes still scanning the room as if expecting the men to reappear. She set the cup down in front of Daniel and lingered a moment, biting her lower lip before speaking. "You probably deserve to know who they are," she said quietly, the words nearly lost beneath the soft hiss of the espresso machine and the muted clink of glassware. Daniel wrapped his hands around the warm cup and waited. He had learned long ago that silence often opened doors faster than questions. Nina took a breath that trembled on the way out. Those three, they're not just rich guys out for drinks. They're the golden trio of harbor tech. You know, the shipping tech company that's on every billboard in the city? Her voice tightened. They built a billion-dollar empire running logistics across half the coast. People call them visionaries, but everyone in the harbor knows the other stories. Contracts won with intimidation, suppliers squeezed until they break, lawsuits that never see daylight because payouts buy silence. The words sank like stones in the small space between them. Daniel nodded once, absorbing each detail without a flicker of surprise. He had heard enough dockside rumors to recognize the shape of power Nina described, but her next sentence carried a sharper edge. They own nearly half the marina contracts, she continued. Every pier, every dry dock permit. If they decide someone's out of favor, that person just disappears from the business. No work, no customers. It doesn't matter how honest or skilled you are, they can cut you off without leaving a fingerprint. Daniel let the coffee's heat settle into his palms, while the weight of her words settled deeper. His mind pictured Ava sleeping peacefully across town, the soft glow of the nightlight in her room, the quiet rhythm of a house he had worked so hard to keep steady after his wife's passing. Everything he did, the long hours at the boat repair shop, the careful budgeting, the unspoken promises, was for the life they were rebuilding together. And now three men with unchecked power had noticed him. Nina's eyes searched his face, perhaps expecting anger or fear. Instead, she found the steady calm of someone who had once pulled sailors from capsized boats in hurricane seas. Daniel had learned to separate real danger from imagined panic, to measure threats in their true dimensions. The three men were dangerous, yes, but not supernatural. They were men who relied on fear to do most of their work for them. He took a sip of the coffee, the bitterness grounding him. "Thank you for telling me," he said, his voice even. "It helps to know the shape of the current." Her shoulders eased a fraction, but she still looked uneasy. "I'm sorry if I've put you in a bad position," she said. I didn't know who else would help." "You did nothing wrong," he said, a quiet finality in the words. "What happened tonight was on them, not you." Outside, rain streaked down the window, each droplet catching the streetlights and stretching into thin lines of silver. The bar felt smaller now, the ceiling lower, as if the weight of what had been spoken pressed down on every beam. Somewhere beyond that glass, the black sedan still waited, engine idling like a patient thought. Daniel considered his next move carefully. Backing down wasn't an option. Every instinct he trusted told him that retreat only fed the kind of men who thrived on fear. But neither could he charge forward recklessly and risk the stability he'd built for Ava. The path ahead would have to be measured, deliberate, like reading a tide chart before setting out at dawn. He finished his coffee and let the silence return, steady as the river beyond the rain, knowing that tonight had shifted more than the air inside the bar. Something larger had begun, and the choices he made from here on would shape far more than his own life. The rain had thinned to a mist by the time Daniel stepped out of the bar, but the street still glistened like dark glass. Every lamp along the riverfront threw shimmering halos across the slick cobblestones. He pulled his jacket tighter and kept his stride unhurried, the night air sharp with salt and the faint metallic scent of wet iron. The music from inside faded behind him until only the quiet hiss of rain and the low hum of the river remained. His truck waited under a leaning streetlight, beads of water sliding down its faded blue paint. He was halfway there when movement flickered near the alley beside the bar. A man stepped from the shadows, tall and trim in a rain-darkened coat, his expression caught between charm and challenge. The forced smile landed first. "Mr. Cole, isn't it?" the stranger said, as though they were acquaintances meeting by chance. He extended a perfectly dry hand despite the drizzle. "I wanted to say, sorry if things inside got out of hand. Just a misunderstanding." Daniel paused a few feet away. The man's eyes were sharp, the kind that never rested, even when his mouth performed politeness. Daniel made no move to shake the offered hand. The stranger's smile tightened. "Name's Barrett," he added, as if the name should carry weight. "One of the partners at Harbor Tech." Daniel gave the slightest nod. He had no interest in small talk, and less in pretending this was a chance encounter. Barrett let his arm fall, but continued with a rehearsed ease. "Long night for all of us. Sometimes drinks mix with old business stress and, well, words come out wrong. I'd like to think we can let it end there." The cadence was smooth, but the eyes stayed cold. Daniel's silence stretched long enough to make the rain seem louder. Barrett exhaled softly, then adjusted the cuff of his coat. "I hear you run a boat repair shop near the docks. Good little business, from what I'm told. Reliable clients. It'd be a shame if accidents happen down there. Things break, tides rise, permits get messy. You know how unpredictable the waterfront can be." Each word landed with the weight of something darker than casual observation. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. In the Coast Guard, he had learned that the most effective reply in a standoff is often none at all. He let the silence fill the space until it was almost physical, a quiet wall Barrett couldn't climb. The man shifted, his carefully polished confidence cracking just enough to show the edge beneath. Rain tapped the brim of his coat and ran in thin lines down his cheek. "I'm sure you understand," he said finally, a faint trace of frustration slipping through. Daniel held his gaze, steady as a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. No threat returned, no bargain offered, only that unyielding stillness. Barrett's smile faltered. He glanced toward the street where a black sedan idled, headlights cutting narrow beams through the mist. After a moment he gave a short, tight nod, as though conceding an invisible round. "Well, good night, Mr. Cole," he said, retreating with the same controlled steps he had arrived with. Daniel watched until the sedan pulled away, its taillights dissolving into the wet dark. He listened to the rain reclaim the silence and felt the old instincts stirring, a sense he'd known on rescue missions when a calm sea hit a rising storm. Tonight's encounter wasn't an ending. It was the first ripple of something larger moving beneath the surface. He climbed into his truck, water dripping from his jacket, and rested his hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. In his mind, he marked every detail: the name, the car, the tone that turned an apology into a threat. The river beyond the docks lay invisible in the fog, but he could feel its current shifting. Whatever this was, it had only just begun. The kitchen filled with the soft crackle of butter and the warm, sweet smell of pancakes as the first light of morning slipped across the window panes. Daniel stood at the stove, turning each golden round with practiced ease, the sound of the spatula tapping against the skillet steadying his thoughts. The coffee maker gurgled in the background, releasing a comforting aroma that curled through the small house. It could have been any ordinary morning, and he wanted it to feel that way for Ava. She bounded into the room in her socks, hair still mussed from the sleepover, her voice bright with excitement. "Dad, we stayed up till almost midnight." "We painted these giant cardboard castles, and Maya's dog tried to sit in the paint tray. It was hilarious." She slid into her chair at the small wooden table, laughter bubbling in her words. Daniel smiled and poured syrup into a small pitcher. "Sounds like a serious art marathon," he said, keeping his tone light. He carried the stack of pancakes to the table, the steam rising like a gentle fog. Ava grabbed a fork and continued without pause. "I'm going to build a whole scene for the school art fair. Maybe a forest with real moss, or maybe a city with tiny lights. Which do you think would be cooler?" He sat across from her, pouring coffee into his mug, and let her words fill the room like birdsong. Each detail she shared, the messy paint, the whispered late-night stories, felt like a small victory against the memory of the black sedan and the man in the alley. He wanted her world to stay bright and unshaken, a place where danger belonged only to fairy tales. She drizzled syrup over her pancakes and looked up with eager eyes. Maybe I can use those sparkly paints we saw last week, she added, chewing thoughtfully. Daniel nodded, taking a sip of coffee to hide the tightening in his chest. Sparkly paints sound perfect, he said. What colors do you think will make the forest, or the city, come alive? Ava grinned. Emerald green for the trees, maybe some deep blue for night sky. And gold. Definitely gold. Her voice painted the room brighter than the dawn itself, but beneath Daniel's calm surface, the tension from last night lay coiled and alert. He kept listening, asking gentle questions, all while the image of Barrett's sharp smile and that black car hovered like a shadow he refused to let touch the morning. Then a soft hum reached his ears, barely noticeable over Ava's chatter and the clink of forks. Through the front window, he caught the slow glide of headlights, a black sedan moving past their house at a crawl that was too deliberate to be casual. His pulse spiked, but he didn't turn his head sharply. Years of rescue work had trained him to notice without betraying a thing. Instead, he smiled at Ava and leaned slightly forward. "Tell me more about the gold paint," he said, voice as steady as the coffee cup in his hands. She brightened, launching into a description of glitter and sunlight while he filed the details of the car. Dark-tinted windows, the soft idle of the engine, the way it paused at the corner before disappearing, each fact tucked into his mind like coordinates on a tide chart. When the last drop of coffee cooled and Ava set down her fork with a satisfied sigh, the house felt warm and safe again. But Daniel knew the calm was only surface deep. He cleared the plates, letting her cheerful words linger like music, and promised himself that whatever storm was gathering outside, it would not reach her. Not now, not ever. By late morning, the rain had thinned to a bright haze over the marina, the kind that left the air heavy with salt and the scent of seaweed drying on the rocks. Daniel stood in the open bay of his boat repair shop, sleeves rolled to the elbow, running a cloth over a freshly sanded hull. The rhythmic scrape of metal on wood usually cleared his mind, but today every sound seemed to carry an echo of last night. He replayed the scene in the bar, the black sedan outside his window at breakfast, and the way Barrett's words, "accidents happen," still lingered like a low-tide smell that wouldn't fade. The rumble of a familiar truck pulled him back. Miguel stepped out, grinning beneath a ball cap darkened by mist. "Figured it was time my outboard got some love," he said, lifting a small crate of tools from his flatbed. The two men clasped hands, the greeting of old comrades who had once shared storms and mid-ocean rescues. Miguel's eyes scanned Daniel's face with the practiced quickness of someone trained to read a situation before words were spoken. "You look like a man whose night didn't end when the bar closed," he said, half a question hidden in the comment. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the workbench. For a moment he considered deflecting, but the memory of long shifts together in churning seas overrode the instinct. If there was anyone who would understand the quiet pressure of a threat, it was Miguel. He recounted the night in measured detail. The three men cornering Nina, the line he had drawn, the midnight encounter outside where a handshake turned into a warning. Miguel listened without interrupting, his brow tightening as each piece fell into place. When Daniel finished, silence filled the shop except for the soft lap of water against pilings. Miguel set down a wrench and rested his forearms on the bench. "Those instincts you leaned on out there in the storms," he said, voice steady, "they weren't just for the ocean. They were for moments exactly like this." Daniel let the words settle. The Coast Guard had drilled discipline and precision into them until it was second nature. Read the current, chart the variables, move with intent. Those habits hadn't left him. They had only gone quiet until now. Miguel reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook. "I still keep in touch with a few harbor police," he said. "Good people who don't owe those harbor tech suits a thing. And there's the old rescue network, divers, skippers, folks who watch each other's backs even after the uniform is gone. If you need eyes on the water or a quiet call when something shifts, these are the ones you trust." He slid the notebook across the workbench. Daniel looked at the names and numbers written in neat block letters. Each one felt like a rope tossed across rough water. "I appreciate this," he said, meaning every word. Miguel shrugged. "You'd do the same. The sea taught us something bigger than rescue drills. It taught us that trouble doesn't announce itself, and when it comes, you don't wait to see if it's serious. You prepare." Outside, gulls wheeled above the gray water, their cries sharp against the muted morning. Daniel felt the knot of tension in his chest loosen, not because the danger was gone, but because he was no longer facing it alone. He realized that his past, the long nights of coordinated rescues, the silent trust of a crew bound by unspoken vows, wasn't just memory. It was a living network that could help safeguard what mattered most on land, the life he'd built for Ava, the shop that kept them afloat, the quiet home they shared. He gripped Miguel's shoulder in thanks, the gesture carrying more than words could hold. The storm on the horizon hadn't vanished, but now Daniel knew he had charts, allies, and the discipline of the sea within him. What once saved lives in raging water might yet protect everything he loved on shore. By Wednesday, the first cracks began to show. What started as a single missed email on Monday became a pattern by midweek. Contracts that once renewed with a handshake and a single signature were suddenly under review. The phrase showed up in subject lines and phone calls, polite but hollow, like a door that sounds locked even before you try the handle. Suppliers who usually greeted him with easy banter now replied with clipped messages about delayed shipments and unexpected inventory checks. One marina manager he'd known for years, a man who used to drop by the shop just to swap fishing stories, stopped answering calls altogether. Daniel stood at his workbench surrounded by the smell of varnish and salt, reading the silence between each interaction more than the words themselves. This wasn't coincidence. It was a slow tightening, precise and invisible, the kind of pressure that doesn't make a splash until the structure buckles. He could almost feel Barrett's voice threaded through it, the cool promise that accidents happen. The old instincts that had carried him through night rescues surfaced, steady and sharp. Panic, he knew, was the quickest way to drown. Instead, he treated each setback like a diver charting changing currents. He logged every missed delivery, every hesitant email, every client who suddenly needed a little more time to decide. Patterns emerged. The delays clustered around docks controlled by harbor tech. The silence came from people with something to lose if they answered. The picture was as clear as a tide map. When dusk settled over the marina, Daniel flipped on the shop lights and turned his focus outward. If the big contracts were being quietly choked, he would feed strength into different lines. He called small independent fishermen he'd helped through countless storm seasons, offering late-night service at a discount, promising to keep their boats seaworthy no matter how tight the schedule. Some were surprised to hear from him. More than a few had already sensed the chill in the harbor air and answered with gratitude. One skipper said he'd drive his vessel across 2 inlets just to keep business with someone who stood up when it counted. By the time the last call ended, the shop smelled of engine oil and fresh possibility. He swept the floor himself, letting the broom's soft rasp become a rhythm for thought. Quiet alliances, he reminded himself, often outlasted loud ones. The Coast Guard had proven that night after night. Real strength wasn't in a single heroic gesture, but in the invisible weave of people who had each other's backs when the weather turned. Outside, the tide crept higher against the pilings, carrying the distant hum of foghorns and the briny scent of kelp. Daniel paused at the doorway, feeling the damp air settle on his skin. Somewhere across the dark water, men like Barrett might be congratulating themselves on how quickly they could tighten a noose. But the harbor had always belonged to those who understood patience. Currents shifted, storms passed, and those who knew how to read the water found ways to stay upright when others went under. He locked up for the night with a quiet certainty. The pressure was real, but so was his resolve. Every name in his notebook, every independent captain he had spoken to, every promise of service was another anchor set deep against the coming storm. What they were trying to starve, he was already learning how to feed. The rain returned just after sunset, a soft, steady curtain that turned the marina lights into wavering halos. Daniel was closing up for the night, the shop warm with the smell of varnish and salt water, when a knock tapped against the half-rolled door. He glanced up and saw Nina standing there in a raincoat far too thin for the weather, a paper bag clutched tight to her chest. Water darkened her hair and ran in quick rivulets down her cheeks, but what struck him most was the look in her eyes, determined, yet carrying a tremor that no umbrella could hide. "I hope I'm not too late," she said, stepping inside before he could answer. She set the bag on the workbench and peeled back the paper to reveal a still warm loaf of bread. The scent of yeast and rosemary filled the room, an almost disarming comfort. "I baked this after my shift," she added, with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Daniel thanked her and motioned toward a chair, reading the tension in her posture. She sat but didn't let go of her bag right away, fingers tracing the damp seam. "I needed to tell you something," she began, voice quiet but urgent. "One of those men, Barrett, I think that was his name, came to the bar tonight, alone this time. He waited until everyone was busy and asked me to step outside for a moment." Daniel's hands tightened on the edge of the workbench, but he stayed silent, letting her set the pace. "He said they'd make it worth my while if I kept last week's incident to myself," she continued, eyes fixed on the floor. "Cash, connections, whatever I wanted. He said it could all just disappear like it never happened. I told him no." The words wavered but didn't break. "I told him I wouldn't lie for them." A long pause followed, filled only by the patter of rain on the metal roof. Daniel crossed the room and knelt slightly so they were at eye level. "That took guts," he said, steady and clear. "You don't have to face this alone." Her shoulders loosened just enough for a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Part of me was scared he'd follow me here," she admitted. "I wasn't sure if coming to you was too much." "You came to the right place," Daniel said. "If they think they can scare you into silence, they need to understand it won't work." They sat for a moment in the hum of the shop's old fluorescent lights. Then Daniel pulled a thick, grease-smudged notebook from a drawer and set it on the bench. "From now on, we document everything," he said. "Names, times, what was said, every call, every visit. We keep a clean trail they can't rewrite." Nina nodded, her jaw firming. "I wrote down what happened tonight, even the time and the weather," she said, producing a folded sheet of paper from her bag. "I figured proof matters." "It does," Daniel replied, impressed by her foresight. He slid the paper into the notebook and wrote a fresh date across the top of a blank page, adding quick, precise notes beneath hers. Outside, the rain picked up, drumming harder against the roof. Inside, something else gathered, quiet resolve, the kind that doesn't announce itself but holds fast like a well-set anchor. What had begun as a single warning in a dimly lit bar was becoming something larger than either of them had planned, a stand not just against three men, but against the way power tried to buy silence. When Nina finally rose to leave, the loaf of bread still warm on the counter, Daniel walked her to the door. The night smelled of wet earth and salt. "Call me if anything else happens," he said, "no matter the hour." She nodded, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that matched his own. "I will," she said, and stepped into the rain, leaving behind the quiet proof that courage, once chosen, rarely walks alone. The marina smelled of salt and diesel when Daniel locked the shop early and headed toward a quiet cafe tucked behind the harbor offices. The evening fog rolled in low and slow, wrapping the docks in silver haze. Miguel had set the meeting with a few short texts, each one carrying the weight of the unspoken trust they'd built in storm rescues years ago. By the time Daniel arrived, the cafe was nearly empty, just the faint hiss of the espresso machine and the soft creak of boats against their moorings outside. At a corner table sat a harbor official named Celeste, her city-issued jacket folded neatly beside a stack of charts, and across from her, a man with a weathered notebook and a reporter's steady eyes. Daniel recognized him instantly. Eli Ward, the investigative journalist he had once hauled from a capsized sailboat in a squall 5 years earlier. The reunion carried no fanfare, only a quiet nod of gratitude that lingered in Eli's expression. Daniel took a seat, the wooden chair sighing under his weight. He placed a plain envelope on the table, heavy with printed messages, dates, and Nina's carefully written accounts of each encounter. He began speaking in the same deliberate tone he used when giving coordinates during a rescue. Calm, precise, every fact tethered to time and place. He described the night at the bar, Barrett's midnight threat, the silent chokehold on his business, and Nina's second confrontation. He didn't dramatize. He simply laid out the sequence like a map of shifting tides. Celeste listened with the alert stillness of someone used to spotting hidden currents in a busy harbor. Eli took notes in quick strokes, occasionally looking up with the measured focus of a man already assembling angles and follow-up questions in his mind. When Daniel finished, he slid Nina's written statements and the screenshots of Barrett's messages across the table. The paper edges caught faintly in a gust from the door before settling under Celeste's hand. For a long moment no one spoke. The cafe's soft jazz seemed to come from another world. Finally Celeste exhaled. "This isn't just intimidation," she said quietly. "It's a pattern of control. If what you're saying holds up, and this looks solid, it could force a full compliance review. Those men rely on the docks to move their ships. We can make that leverage work both ways." Eli leaned forward, his notebook now closed. "This has the bones of a major exposé," he said, "not gossip, systemic abuse of contracts, coercion, and a culture of fear. People will talk once they know someone else has started. You'd be surprised how quickly silence cracks when it stops feeling lonely." Daniel watched them absorb the story, the tension in his chest shifting from tightness to a quiet readiness. He hadn't come here for vengeance. What he felt wasn't the burn of payback, but the steadier pull of accountability. The thought of Ava asleep at home flickered through his mind, the safe warmth of her room, and he knew that this fight was about ensuring that safety reached further than his own walls. Celeste gathered the papers into a careful stack. "We'll handle the official channels," she said. "Nothing rash. You keep doing what you do. Stay steady." Eli gave a ball-knowing smile. "And when the time is right, people will read the truth. The kind they can't buy their way out." Outside, the foghorn moaned like a distant promise. As Daniel stepped back into the damp night, the harbor lights glowed faintly through the mist, their reflections shifting on the water. He felt the tide within him subtly turn. This wasn't about striking back. It was about standing long enough for the truth to surface, about letting quiet, careful action do what anger never could. The storm had not passed, but its direction was changing. The house was wrapped in a calm so deep it felt almost oceanic, the kind of quiet that settles after a storm but still remembers the waves. Daniel moved softly through the hallway, careful not to wake Ava as he pushed her door open a few inches. The warm glow of her nightlight painted gentle arcs across the walls, turning the corners of the room into soft shadows. She was already asleep, one arm curled beneath her cheek, her hair fanned out like a halo on the pillow. The faint rhythm of her breathing filled the space, steady and untroubled. He stood there longer than usual, leaning against the doorframe, letting the sight of her wash through the tension that still hummed in his chest. Every detail from the day, the black sedan, Barrett's cold warning, the quiet meeting at the harbor cafe, passed through his mind in a silent tide. Fear whispered its case, listing what could happen if Harbor Tech pushed harder. But another voice, lower and steadier, spoke of something else. Purpose. The thin line between them had never felt sharper. His eyes drifted to the small dresser beside Ava's bed. A framed photo of his late wife, Claire, caught the nightlight's glow. She was smiling in the picture, hair wind-tossed from a beach day years ago. For a moment it felt as if she was in the room, watching with that quiet conviction she always carried. He could almost hear her saying what she had said so many times when decisions loomed large: do what keeps her world honest. Daniel stepped closer to the bed and pulled the blanket a little higher over Ava's shoulder. Protecting her had always meant keeping danger outside their door, steady income, safe neighborhood, food on the table. Tonight he understood it went deeper. Real protection wasn't only about locks and steady paychecks, it was about giving her a living example of courage. If he let intimidation decide his actions, he would teach her to shrink when confronted with wrong. That was a lesson he could never allow. The promise formed silently, as firm as any vow he had ever spoken aloud. This house would remain a place of truth. No amount of pressure, no veiled threat would twist it into something smaller. He would stand not only to keep her physically safe, but to show her that silence in the face of wrongdoing is its own kind of danger. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his calloused fingers barely grazing her skin. The gesture carried every unspoken memory of rescues at sea, moments when lives depended on calm action and quiet resolve. What he faced now was different, but called on the same discipline: patience, preparation, the refusal to yield to fear. Down the hall, the clock ticked toward midnight. Rain still whispered against the windows, but inside the air felt grounded, steady. Daniel exhaled slowly, letting the day's weight settle into something he could carry. Claire's photo seemed to meet his eyes once more, a silent affirmation that he was choosing the path she would have wanted. Before closing the door, he took one last look at Ava, her face soft with dreams untouched by the battles outside. In that quiet, he understood that every choice ahead, each document saved, each alliance formed, each steady word, was a strand in the larger shield he was building for her. The world beyond their walls might be shifting, but here, truth would remain the foundation. He eased the door until only a thin line of light remained, then let it click softly shut, carrying with him a resolve as deep and calm as the sea on its most faithful day. Dawn broke in a muted wash of gray, the kind of morning when the harbor seemed to breathe in long, quiet intervals. Daniel poured his coffee and leaned on the kitchen counter, the scent of roasted beans mixing with the faint salt drifting through the cracked window. Ava was still asleep, her school bag packed and waiting by the door. For a few minutes he simply listened to the tick of the clock and the distant groan of gulls. Then his phone buzzed on the counter, a low vibration that felt heavier than its sound. On the screen glowed a headline that cut through the calm like a sudden squall. Untouchable? Inside the culture of intimidation at Harbor Tech. Below it sat a byline he recognized: Eli Ward. Daniel opened the article and the room seemed to narrow around the glow of the text. Eli's words unfurled with deliberate force. Names were printed in bold: Barrett, Klein, Mason, the Golden Trio. Anonymous employees spoke of contracts sealed with threats, of silence purchased through fear. Former dock workers described safety violations hidden with payoffs. Screenshots of messages, including the ones Nina had saved, appeared as cold, undeniable proof. The narrative traced the same map Daniel had laid out days earlier at the cafe, but added voices from every corner of the harbor. People he had never met had decided to speak now that someone else had lit the way. Daniel felt a slow exhale leave his chest, part relief and part the quiet realization that the tide had indeed turned. The men who once strode into a bar, certain of their power, now looked small beneath the weight of their own record. Social media flooded with corroborating stories, crew members recounting sudden firings, suppliers posting old emails of threats disguised as negotiations. Within an hour, the Harbor Tech name trended for all the wrong reasons. But alongside the relief came something steadier and heavier. He knew storms rarely ended with a single strike. Retaliation or retreat. The choice now rested with the very men who had promised that accidents could happen. He could almost picture them in some high-rise office, voices sharp behind closed doors, lawyers drafting denials that smelled of panic. A new notification slid across the phone. Harbor Tech responds. He tapped it and found the statement he expected, carefully worded, polished like a corporate deck. The CEOs denied wrongdoing, called the article sensational, and promised an internal review. But their words rang hollow against the flood of first-hand accounts pouring in by the minute. Even to an ordinary reader, the contrast was glaring, a fortress trying to stand against an ocean already inside its walls. Daniel sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. He thought of Nina starting her shift with a little more lightness in her step, of Miguel probably reading the piece over a second mug, of Celeste at the harbor office quietly preparing the official wheels that would now turn faster. He thought of Ava, still asleep in her room, where truth remained, the air she breathed. The morning light strengthened, revealing the faint glimmer of rain on the window pane. Somewhere beyond the harbor, decisions were being made, stock prices, board meetings, emergency PR calls. But here, in this small kitchen, the quiet choice he had made days ago felt even more solid. This was never about revenge. It was about making sure power didn't stay hidden, about showing his daughter that courage was measured not in anger, but in persistence. He set the empty cup in the sink and glanced once more at the headline. The storm surge had arrived. What came next might still be rough water, but the current had shifted, and for the first time since that night in the bar, he felt the truth moving with him. The first sign arrived before sunrise, a terse email stamped urgent from the harbor safety office. Daniel stood at the kitchen counter, reading the words twice, his coffee cooling untouched. An anonymous complaint had flagged serious safety concerns at his boat repair shop. Until an inspection cleared it, operations were to remain closed. No details, no explanation, only the weight of an official seal that threatened to grind his livelihood to a halt. By the time he reached the shop, the notice was already taped to the door, its bright orange edges catching the early light like a warning flare. He peeled it back and read the legal phrasing again, feeling the sharp clarity of recognition. This was no coincidence. It carried the same cold fingerprint as Barrett's midnight threat and the silent chokehold on his contracts. Harbor Tech hadn't retreated. They had simply changed tactics. The retaliation didn't stop at the door. When he opened his laptop to check the day's schedule, a flood of one-star reviews glared back, each posted in the early hours, each a vague accusation of poor workmanship or hidden fees. None of the names matched his customer list. The sudden drop in his rating looked engineered to turn first-time clients away. For a long minute, he stood in the quiet shop, the scent of salt and machine oil grounding him against the rising tide of anger. Panic would be useless. He knew this from countless rescue missions when the sea turned violent without warning. He set the laptop aside and pulled a fresh page from his logbook, noting every review, every timestamp, every irregularity. Facts were anchors. Word of the closure spread quickly along the docks, but the effect was nothing Harbor Tech expected. By noon, Miguel arrived with a thermos of strong coffee and a grin that carried more defiance than worry. "The guys are talking," he said. "Nobody's buying the story." Not long after, two fishermen knocked on the shop's side door with a petition already half-filled with signatures demanding the inspection be expedited and fair. They handed over a bundle of spare parts they'd sourced on their own. "Figured you might need these while the suits sort themselves out," one of them said. Soon the driveway became a quiet harbor of its own. Boat owners who had trusted Daniel for years pulled up with trailers and small skiffs, asking if he could work from home until the shop reopened. They left glowing reviews on every platform they could find, countering the false ones with detailed accounts of midnight rescue repairs and storms weathered together. Someone set up a community page titled, "Keep Cole's Boats Afloat," and within hours, photographs and stories poured in from neighbors, former Coast Guard colleagues, and customers spanning decades. Daniel worked steadily through the afternoon, moving essential tools to a covered space beside the house. The sound of wrenches and the familiar tang of engine grease replaced the silence the CEOS had tried to impose. Ava helped after school, handing him sockets and sorting bolts with a focus that made him quietly proud. She didn't need to know every detail to sense that they were standing for something larger than a business license. As evening settled, the driveway buzzed with the low conversations of friends and customers dropping off work and words of support. What had been intended as an isolated punishment had become a gathering point, a place where people's quiet loyalty surfaced stronger than fear. Daniel looked around at the small fleet of boats waiting for his care and felt the same steady conviction that once guided him through black water rescues. In the distance, he imagined the harbor tech boardrooms where plans were unraveling, their carefully scripted pressure campaign exposed as desperation. What they had meant to break had instead revealed the strength beneath it. The storm was still moving, but the current no longer belonged to them. The first camera crew arrived just after dawn, their van tires hissing on wet pavement. Daniel was tightening a propeller bolt in his driveway when a young reporter in a bright raincoat approached, microphone lowered in a gesture of respect. She explained that the story of a small boat repair shop defying a billion-dollar shipping tech empire was already running on the morning news. People wanted to meet the man behind the quiet stand. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and, after a pause, agreed to speak. By mid-morning, 2 more stations had called. Word of the bogus safety complaint and the sudden flood of fake reviews had spread faster than the harbor fog. Yet what drew people in wasn't just the confrontation. It was the way his neighbors rallied. Interviews with fishermen and longtime customers painted a picture of a man who had repaired boats at midnight before a storm, who had delivered fuel during a blackout, who had taught local kids how to patch their own hulls for free. The narrative that emerged was less about a business under siege and more about a community refusing to let one of its own stand alone. Reporters were especially struck by his past as a Coast Guard rescue diver. Miguel, who had served with him, described nights when Daniel dove into black water without hesitation to pull strangers from capsized boats. Archival photos surfaced of rescues on storm-lashed piers, faces blurred by rain but unmistakably his. The image of a man who had risked his life for others made the anonymous one-star attacks look petty and thin. Daniel kept his answers simple when the microphones turned his way. He talked about work that mattered, about keeping boats safe for families who depended on the sea. He didn't name-call or speculate about the harbor tech executives. Instead, he spoke of honesty, patience, and the belief that fear loses power when people tell the truth together. His calm only deepened the contrast with the bluster coming from corporate press releases. Support began arriving in ways he hadn't imagined. Strangers from other coastal towns sent emails thanking him for proving that ordinary integrity still counted. Former customers who had moved inland mailed handwritten notes of encouragement. A retired shipbuilder drove 2 hours just to shake his hand and drop off spare parts. New orders flooded in so quickly that he set up a temporary scheduling board in the garage, every slot filled with names and numbers of people who wanted to keep him working while the official inspection dragged on. In the evenings, the driveway glowed with porch lights and conversation. Fishermen dropped by not only for repairs, but to bring home-cooked meals and to share their own stories of standing up to unfair pressure. Ava helped by labeling parts and handing out mugs of cocoa, her shy smile widening as neighbors greeted her like family. The house that once felt tucked away now pulsed as a small but steady harbor of solidarity. Each act of support exposed the miscalculation at the heart of Harbor Tech's campaign. The executives had tried to isolate him, betting that silence and inconvenience would erode his resolve. Instead, they revealed how deep his roots ran. What was meant to break his reputation became the proof of its strength. Every news segment that aired, every social media post that celebrated his calm defiance made the corporate denials sound thinner. When the last camera crew packed up and the night settled over the waterfront, Daniel stood beneath the porch light and watched the reflection of stars ripple across the harbor. The tide was turning, not because of any single headline, but because people recognized something solid and familiar in his choice to stand firm. The attempt to cut him off had instead bound an entire community closer, and the quiet power of that truth was something no corporation could buy or bury. High above the harbor, where rain streaked the windows of HarborTech's gleaming headquarters, the silence inside the boardroom was heavier than the storm outside. The long glass table, once a stage for confident deals and smooth laughter, now felt like a fault line. Barrett, Klein, and Mason sat apart instead of shoulder to shoulder, their phones buzzing with messages they didn't want to read. The morning's investor call had bled into chaos. Shareholders demanded explanations, their voices sharp with the kind of impatience money cannot soothe. Stock prices had dipped hard enough to trigger alerts across global markets, and the media cycle refused to let go of the story. 2 board members had already resigned before noon, issuing terse statements about personal reasons that fooled no one. Their abrupt exits left empty chairs that felt like accusations. The remaining members spoke in careful, clipped tones, asking about contingency plans, legal exposure, the mounting cost of silence. Every question landed like a stone in deep water, and each answer only deepened the stillness. In the center of the table lay a printout of the article that started it all. Untouchable? Inside the culture of intimidation at HarborTech. Highlighter marks circled phrases like anonymous employees and pattern of coercion. Someone had scrawled verify in the margin, but by now everyone knew the truth didn't need more proof. Overnight, more whistleblowers had sent emails to journalists and regulators. Screenshots of internal chats surfaced online, and none of them flattered the company. Barrett broke the quiet first, his voice sharper than he intended. "We could have contained this if certain people had done their part," he said, eyes cutting toward Klein. Klein leaned back, jaw tight. "Don't start with me. I told you the bar incident would light a match. You wanted it handled quietly. Well, this is what quietly looks like when it blows up." Mason, usually the one to smooth arguments, sat rigid, tapping a pen against the table until it snapped in two. "Enough. Blaming each other in front of the board makes us look worse than the headlines already do." But his own eyes betrayed the same calculation, a silent ledger of who had dragged them here. A junior aide entered with a tablet, her face pale. "More emails leaked," she said softly, "including, last month's internal memo about contract pressure on small vendors." The room's temperature seemed to drop. Everyone knew the memo's tone, brusque directives to ensure compliance that would now read like a confession. Investors on the video wall shifted restlessly. One older man adjusted his glasses and spoke with icy precision. "This isn't a market fluctuation," he said. "This is a crisis of trust. If you cannot demonstrate control and integrity, we will be forced to consider leadership changes." No one replied. The faint hum of the HVAC filled the silence like distant surf. For years, their empire had been defined by speed. Quick mergers, lightning negotiations, the confidence of men who believed the harbor itself bent to their will. Now the same structure trembled, not from a competitor or a market crash, but from the quiet courage of ordinary people refusing to look away. A single fisherman's petition, a waitress's written account, a boat repairman's steady resolve, these had done what lawsuits and lobbying never could. Barrett rubbed his temples and muttered something about tightening legal teams. Klein scrolled through messages that multiplied faster than he could read. Mason stared at the rain running down the glass, his reflection fractured by each drop. For the first time in their meteoric rise, the question wasn't how to grow bigger, but how much of their own foundation would still be standing when the tide finally receded. Outside, the harbor lay hidden under gray mist, but the pressure inside that room was the real storm, and it was only beginning to break. A thin winter sun hung low over the harbor when Daniel received the message. It came as a short, formal email with no company letterhead, just a name and a request for a quiet conversation. Mason, youngest of the 3 Harbor Tech founders, wanted to meet in person. The tone carried none of Barrett's slickness or Klein's blunt edge. It was careful, almost humble, as though the sender had rewritten it more than once before pressing send. Daniel read it twice at the shop's counter, the scent of machine oil and sea salt grounding him as he considered his answer. Weeks had passed since the article shattered Harbor Tech's facade. Investigations were now public record, and 2 of the CEOs had retreated from view behind lawyers and statements. Yet Mason, who had once sat silent in that corner of the bar, now reached out directly. Daniel replied with a time and a place, neutral ground on a quiet pier, where the tide's rhythm drowned out casual eavesdropping. They met at dusk. The water below the boards shifted in long silver swells, and gulls circled with lazy cries. Mason arrived alone, coat unbuttoned, face lined with a fatigue that no corporate polish could hide. He extended a hand, but didn't push when Daniel simply nodded in greeting. For a long moment they stood in the sharp salt air, 2 silhouettes against a dimming sky, until Mason began to speak. "I need to say something I should have said weeks ago," he started, voice lower than Daniel expected. "I didn't want it to go this far. The intimidation, the midnight visits, the fake complaints, I argued against all of it." He looked out over the darkening water. "But I didn't stop it either. That's on me." Daniel watched him carefully, weighing every pause. Mason went on, "Harbor Tech's not what we dreamed when we started. It's become a machine we don't fully control. I don't want to be the man who keeps breaking people to keep it running. I can help repair the damage to your contracts, restore the supply routes, make sure inspectors see the truth. But it has to start with owning what we did." The words hung there, carried by the brackish wind. Daniel let the silence stretch, measuring sincerity the way he once measured currents, by what moved beneath the surface. "If you're serious," he said at last, "then it can't be just about me. Nina's safety comes first, and there needs to be a public apology, not a lawyer's draft. Your names, your words." Mason nodded without hesitation. "Agreed," he said. "She should never have been touched by this. Neither of you should have." Daniel studied him a moment longer. He thought of Ava asleep back home, of the quiet promise he'd made to keep their house a place of truth. He thought of the neighbors who had stood in his driveway with petitions and coffee, of Miguel and Celeste and Eli. This meeting was not about winning or leverage. It was about ending something harmful without leaving bitterness to grow in its place. "You follow through on those 2 things," Daniel said finally, "and I'll work with you to set things right. But understand, this isn't a negotiation. It's a commitment to do the right thing." Mason's shoulders eased as if he had been waiting for that exact line. "Then that's what I'll do," he said simply. The pier creaked softly under their feet as the tide shifted. They parted with a brief nod, no handshake required. As Daniel watched Mason's figure fade into the mist, he felt no triumph, only a quiet steadiness. This was never about proving strength. It was about ensuring that when his daughter asked someday what it meant to stand for something, he could answer with more than words. Morning sunlight spilled over the harbor with the pale gold of early spring when the news broke. Daniel stood by the open garage door of his shop, a wrench in one hand, as a notification flashed across his phone. Harbor Tech issues public apology, commits to industry reforms. The headline alone carried a weight he hadn't dared to expect. He tapped the link and read each word slowly. The statement was clear and direct, signed by all three CEOs, though the cadence echoed Mason's sincerity. They named Nina and Daniel outright, acknowledged the intimidation, and pledged new safeguards to protect workers and small businesses from corporate abuse. They even announced their decision to step back from direct marina control, promising that future contracts would be handled by an independent board. For a long moment, Daniel stayed perfectly still, letting the words settle like a gentle tide. Outside, gulls wheeled in the brightening sky, and the scent of salt and machine oil mingled in the morning air. He thought of the months of tension, the silent pressure, and the community that had refused to look away. The apology wasn't just an admission, it was a door opening towards something better. By afternoon, Celeste from the harbor office confirmed what the article implied. Every contract that had been under review was officially reinstated. Suppliers reached out with warm, almost sheepish calls, offering to resume deliveries and to help catch up on lost time. Messages of support flowed in again, this time lighter, threaded with relief. Miguel stopped by with a grin and a box of donuts, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. "Looks like the tide really turned," he said. Daniel's response was a quiet smile. There was no celebration, no desire for victory laps. He rolled up the shop doors, wiped down his tools, and went back to work. Boats needed patching, engines needed tuning, and the rhythm of honest labor felt like the truest answer to everything that had come before. The community's trust was already shifting toward transparency and steadiness, and he intended to match that trust with quiet reliability. Nina arrived near closing time, her hair pulled back and eyes bright with something between disbelief and hope. She held a letter from Harbor Tech's new Oversight Committee, a full scholarship fund in her name to support women entering hospitality and maritime trades. They called it the Nina Grant, she said, voice unsteady. They wanted to help others who might face what I did. Daniel set aside his tools and listened as she read the letter aloud. Each line carried the sense of turning pain into progress, of choosing to plant something lasting where harm had once tried to grow. When she finished, she looked up, half expecting him to question it. "It's a good thing," Daniel said simply. "It means the truth changed more than just contracts." She nodded, the tension of the past weeks softening into something almost luminous. "I never thought saying no that night could ripple this far." Daniel thought of the quiet courage that had brought them here, her refusal to stay silent, his own decision to draw a line, the neighbors who showed up with signatures and stories. None of it had been about revenge. It had always been about making sure people could work and live without fear. As twilight settled over the harbor, he walked Nina to the door and watched her disappear down the pier, the letter held carefully in her hand. The shop behind him smelled of varnish and salt, the way it always had, but tonight the air carried something new, a sense of renewal, not born of noise but of steady truth. He locked up without ceremony, knowing that real victory often arrives quietly in the ongoing work of a life lived honestly. The harbor lay still under a pale wash of early light, the water so calm it mirrored every pink and silver brushstroke of dawn. Daniel eased the small boat from its mooring, while Ava held the bowline, her breath clouding faintly in the cool air. The engine hummed low as they glided into the open channel, the ripples behind them soft as silk. Salt lingered on the breeze, carrying the faint scent of seaweed and something bright and new, as if the day itself were promising by a fresh start. Ava perched on the bench beside him, hair tucked into a knit cap, eyes wide as she scanned the endless horizon. "It's like glass," she whispered, running her hand along the smooth surface. Daniel smiled and nodded, steering gently toward the deep blue beyond the breakwater. Months had passed since the night when a single quiet sentence had shifted everything. Touch her again and find out. He could still hear the words as clearly as if he had just spoken them, though now they felt less like a threat and more like a simple statement of truth, a line that had carried its own power. What began as an instinctive stand in a crowded bar had rippled outward in ways he never imagined. An investigative article, community solidarity, corporate reform, a scholarship in Nina's name. None of it had been planned. All of it had been necessary. The harbor itself seemed to bear witness to that change. Where there had once been tension and rumor, there was now the quiet rhythm of fishermen loading gear and the easy call of gulls wheeling overhead. The marina's new oversight board had brought a transparency that felt almost as natural as the tide. Contracts now rested on open agreements instead of backroom pressure. Even the boats tied at the docks seemed to ride higher, their masts reflecting a steadier sky. Daniel guided the boat past a cluster of buoys and cut the motor. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft slap of water against the hull. He let Ava take the tiller for a moment and watched her concentrate, a furrow of determination on her small face. He thought of the promise he had made while she slept months ago, that their home would remain a place of truth. Looking at her now, confident and unafraid, he knew the promise had become part of the air they breathed. He didn't feel like a hero. The word belonged to newspaper headlines and stories told from a distance. What he felt instead was something quieter and more enduring. The satisfaction of having stood where it mattered, of being a father and neighbor who refused to let fear decide the future. The strength people credited him with was really the strength of many. Nina's refusal to be silenced, Miguel's steadfast friendship, Celeste's integrity, Eli's careful reporting, the fishermen who showed up with petitions and coffee. Their courage had flowed together like converging tides until even a billion-dollar company had to bend. Ava leaned back against him, her eyes following a pair of gulls rising in slow circles above the water. "It feels different out here," she said. Daniel looked across the brightening horizon, the harbor finally at peace. "It is," he replied. "It is set." His voice soft but certain. The sun lifted higher, turning the sea to liquid gold. He felt the boat rock gently beneath them and knew that the strength that had carried them through those turbulent months wasn't fading with the headlines. It was lasting, quiet as the deep water below, a kind of strength that would guide them through whatever lay beyond this calm morning. In the distance, the gulls wheeled and called, and the harbor breathed steady, as if it too had learned the power of a single, unwavering line. Before you go, share where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will stir your heart in ways you won't see coming.